Hey there, this is Natalie, and in this video I'm going to be responding to an article from the Anime Feminist. Yes, that den of voles. The subject of this article is Mushoku Tensei, and the title is The Consequence of No Consequences, Mushoku Tensei and Excusing Sexual Violence by Garrick Schultz. This article warranted one of these more detailed long responses for not only just flat out misunderstanding or lying about the events in the series, but also for reaching a mind-boggling conclusion about its message and its impact on the world that I had never seen before and really felt the need to talk about. But before I get into this absolute carnival of bad takes, just a reminder that because I'm still very broke and trying to fend off becoming a stray cat girl, I'm still offering various services. No, nothing sketchy, just things like fiction editing and custom voice recordings at way below market rates. And you can find out more or just donate if you can afford it and want to help support the channel by going to my Ko-fi page linked in the description. As a note, if you have ordered a voice recording and I haven't done it yet, it's just because I have really bad hay fever at the moment and I don't sound great, as you can probably tell from this video. I will fulfill you very soon. But with that out of the way, back to Garrick Schultz of the Anime Feminist, and he begins by saying, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant by Stephen R. Donaldson, a novel series published from 1977 to 2013, is one of my favourite works of fantasy ever. It's also infamous for having one of the most loathsome protagonists in modern fiction. The titular character, a misanthropic shut-in who gets transported to another world, sexually assaults a teenage girl in the story's opening act. It's a truly horrific moment. And while Covenant never does anything nearly that monstrous again, the weight of his sin hangs over his neck for the rest of the series. I bring this all up to say that I see the value in stories where the protagonist is a horrible person. Handled well, a story with a main character like this can explore ideas and comment on parts of the human condition that more aspirational protagonists can't. But there's an important factor to the equation: consequences. I don't mean a moralistic, this character did a bad thing and should be punished by the author for it mindset. I mean that when a character does something extreme, for good or ill, it should leave an impact on those caught in its wake. Thomas Covenant assaulting a teenager, for example, has far-reaching effects on her family, and on himself. Aftershocks that would naturally stem from such a terrible act. Any story that wants to explore this darker side of humanity must be willing to explore how doing horrible things affects the world and people around you, or it risks trivializing the true horrors of the darkness it depicts. Well, first of all, why does every article or video complaining about certain elements of Mushoku Tensei always begin with them talking about how, no, I do usually like things where dark stuff happens, or the protagonist is not a paragon, as if that somehow proves anything? But after that predictable intro, he gets into what I think is going to be my main point of disagreement here. A writer is under no obligation to make their story conform to any particular way of thinking or focus on the outcomes of any one event. Typically, when a dark or grey protagonist does something reprehensible, we do see this have consequences on their life and the lives of those affected, because that is the story. For instance, in BoJack Horseman, the bad things he does hugely impact the lives of people around him and catch up with him in unexpected ways, because that is what would happen and a big focus of what his story is about. But you can also have stories with far worse people as protagonists who actually never really face any consequences, and where the consequences on other people are never really focused on. For instance, American Psycho. I'm talking more about the book by Bret Easton Ellis here because it's about 20 years since I saw the movie and I can't really remember whether or not it was a good adaptation. But because it's told from the perspective of Patrick Bateman, we see how messed up his worldview is and all of the terrible things he does. And they go way beyond anything any anime protagonist I can think of does. But we don't really see the effects of what he does on others, and it ends without him being caught. He literally escapes consequences because even if he confesses what he's done, nobody believes him. This is because American Psycho is a commentary on the shallow environment that Bateman is in, and so it serves the purpose of the book for him to be able to get away with everything. It's considered a modern classic, although obviously it is not for everyone, but it shows that a story doesn't have to include consequences to work at what it's trying to do. So if we have consequences in a story where the whole point is how people mess up, like BoJack Horseman, and no consequences in a story about a shallow society like American Psycho, and both of these are generally regarded as good pieces of fiction, then really anything in between can be fine too. And all the writer needs to do is make it work realistically with their setting and characters, and to fit with their story. I would argue, and I probably will in this video, that Mushoku Tensei does handle the consequences of Rudy's actions, and those of other characters in the series, in a way that is appropriate for these characters, for this setting, and for the story the author wants to tell. But now he's finally going to talk about Mushoku Tensei, so buckle up, buckaroos. Mushoku Tensei, funnily enough, starts from much the same place as Thomas Covenant, a misanthropic shut-in transported to another world. Rudeus Greyrat is a PDF file, given a chance to live a better life and repair his toxic patterns. Mushoku Tensei purports to be a story of redemption, exploring how even the most reprehensible person imaginable can grow into a respectable human being. But it undercuts Rudeus's growth by constantly shielding him from the consequences of his actions, even in his new life, twisting its world and characters however it wants to justify and excuse the horrible things he does. This starts early on with Sylphy, a childhood friend who Rudeus forcibly strips, thinking she's a boy. When he goes to apologise, he's awkward and uncomfortable, objectifying her as he fumbles over the words and never actually saying "I'm sorry." But despite that, Sylphy takes the initiative to forgive him and says she doesn't want to let this incident ruin their relationship. To make things worse, Sylphy brings up this incident later as one of the reasons she's attracted to him. Yes, you heard that right. Rudeus violating her boundaries is framed not as something that he must make up for over time or an obstacle in their relationship, but as something that made her fall in love with him. I really hate how people who want to criticise this series always start with the premise being that the main character is a PDF file. I'm really sorry for keeping on using the crap euphemisms, but you know how YouTube is, we just aren't allowed to use grown-up words anymore. Rudeus has been a shut-in for about 20 years at the start of the story. He's basically become addicted to stuff like eroge visual novels and the adult animes, but he's convinced he'll never have a normal life or meet people or have any relationships whatsoever. The point is that he's a failure and has become a degenerate. The way takes like this phrase it makes it sound like he was a person with a specific thing for children who was preying on them and then gets a redemption story. But that's not the premise. Some people do bring up a thing about his niece, but if you're bringing that up, you're either just reacting to rumours you heard on the internet, or you must be a pretty big Mushoku Tensei fan, because that comes up in a deleted chapter of the web novel version of Redundancy, a series of side stories that happen after the main climax of Mushoku Tensei itself. If you've gotten that far, and I have, then you probably understand the story enough not to be basing what you think the story is about on that, again, deleted part. but otherwise, you're just having a knee-jerk reaction to something you've seen people say, and no analysis based on hearsay is worth listening to. The point was never redemption for the most reprehensible type of person. Rudeus never actually did anything. He wasted his life and he regrets it, but aside from disappointing his family, he never hurt anybody at all. Compare that to a Patrick Bateman or even a BoJack Horseman, and tell me again how Rudeus in his past life was the most reprehensible person imaginable because he watched some lolly anime in his room. He died saving people from a truck. He remains a pacifist throughout the story. He's a mixed bag of good and bad intentions even at the very start. Certainly selfish and immature, but he's not a psychopath or evil. He's more supposed to be seen as pathetic. The premise of the story is someone with a lot of problems and trauma learning that he can have a good and what he'd have seen as normal life, with healthy romantic relationships, a job, a family, goals, all of that stuff, if he's given a second chance and he actually tries. It's not that hard to see it. It's literally in the tagline of the light novel series. Things like his degeneracy are part of his starting point, but redeeming them isn't the point of the series. Now, I already talked a lot about the Sylphy undressing scene and the point of that in the story in my video responding to Explanation Point, so I'm not going to go over all of that again. But here he says that the incident was something Sylphy says attracted her to him. And no, she doesn't. She recalls it as a silly childhood memory that they shared. After all, it was just a misunderstanding, and she and Ariel think that recreating that scenario will help him remember her, given she is scared that he's forgotten her. She already thought highly of him as a kid. He'd saved her from bullies, he was her only friend, and he taught her magic, including the voiceless magic that's very, very rare in this world. His teachings saved her life and allowed her to save Ariel during the mass teleportation incident. She reveres him for completely believable reasons, and then falls in love with the man he is now at the academy, after about 10 years apart. A misunderstanding from when they were kids just feels like a funny story to connect them now, and I'm sorry, but I feel like it just would. Is Sylphy supposed to be traumatized by the time her friend thought she was a boy when she was 5, even though she's literally disguising herself as a man now? There are no consequences in terms of it affecting Sylphy, because there just wouldn't be after the whole thing is cleared up. And there are consequences for Rudy, because Paul explains some social things to him that he clearly didn't know from his past life, and because he worries that he's ruined his first real friendship. Since the purpose of the story is Rudy learning how to live a rewarding life, these lessons are important, but Sylphy being more freaked out than a kid actually would be, just because we have to remind everyone that undressing kids is bad, would just feel unnecessary and janky. Next, he shows a screenshot with the subtitles showing Rudy saying, "We'll grow up together and I'll gradually raise her to be my ideal woman." And Garrick's caption is, "You'd think this desire to commit actual child grooming would be challenged somewhere down the line, but no." And, well, no, why would you think it needed to be? The line shows Rudy's immaturity at this time around relationships, but since Paul notices how codependent Rudy and Sylphy have become, and so sends him away to tutor Eris, and then the mass teleportation incident happens, Rudy doesn't see Sylphy again for years, until they're both of age and have had very different, very formative experiences. She hasn't been groomed, so why would Rudy's thoughts here be challenged later in the series? But next, he talks about Lilia. A similar thing happens with Lilia, the family's maid. As a child, Rudeus often steals Lilia's underwear and taunts her with it, leaving her justifiably uncomfortable in his presence. But later on, When it's revealed that Lilia's been sleeping with Rudeus's father Paul, who began their affair by essaying her before it became an allegedly consensual relationship, Rudeus convinces his mom not to kick her out. As a result, Lilia decides Rudeus is not so bad after all and devotes her life to him. You may notice this does not actually address Rudeus's repeated violation of her boundaries, instead emphasizing how noble it was of him to save her. Paul's essay is barely commented on, even as a point of comparison. He's the wrong party only for cheating. Now, this isn't entirely correct. Paul did indeed essay Lilia, but it was many years earlier, and was not the start of the affair that led to her becoming pregnant. That doesn't make the fact that he did it okay, of course, but Paul clearly isn't supposed to be a paragon when it comes to relationships. This scene is literally telling us he's scum in that respect, so I don't see why it isn't okay for it to be a thing in the story. Lilia's backstory isn't shown much in the anime, and so Garrick here again must only know this from rumours and has decided it should be addressed in this scene. But since it's something Rudeus and Zenith wouldn't know at this time, and the start of the affair was actually Lilia, who was sexually frustrated, coming on to Paul, who was also frustrated because Zenith was pregnant, and people in this setting for whatever reason believe you can't have sex when pregnant, Paul succumbed. The cheating is the only thing addressed because it's the only relevant thing he did wrong that the audience and other characters would know about. It's quite simple really if you follow the story being shown to you, rather than stuff you've heard about in angry tweets. Incidentally, the Paul and Lilia thing is shown to have very long-reaching consequences, and if you want to know more about that, check out my video about Aisha, which goes deep into it, but which does also include spoilers. Still, he continues, and I think we can guess where this is going next. The absolute worst of it though, at least in season 1, comes with Rudy's cousin Eris. Rudeus tries to essay Eris twice. Once when he finds her sleeping in a barn and attempts to remove her underwear, and once when she mistakenly comes onto him without fully understanding the situation. And how does Eris react to almost being horrifically violated twice? Slapstick anime violence. That's it. He smacked around in stereotypical angry tsundere fashion. Eris tells him to wait until she's an adult, which is 15 in this world, and no, we don't have time to unpack that. And their relationship remains undamaged. A single smack resets her reactions to him as a love interest. She isn't a person, but a possible future sex dispenser, and any lasting consequences, like feeling unsafe around the relative who attacked her, would get in the way of that. Given how the show treats Paul and Lilia's relationship, it seems to regard the R word as an acceptable precursor to a relationship, or at least not something that's worth getting upset over. Okay, but no, it doesn't. Rather, Eris doesn't feel scared because she is physically much bigger and stronger than him, and given one of her biggest role models is Ghislaine, an extremely powerful sword fighter, she's not really in the mindset that she's weak and vulnerable against Rudy just because she's a girl and he's a boy. His initial perviness towards her is just annoying to her, just as her always beating him up is to him. The second occasion, well, that's there to show us the kinds of machinations nobles like Eris's parents get up to in the setting. Rudy, as inexperienced as he is, also misreads the situation, and when reflecting on it, finally understands that he needs to treat Eris based on what he knows of her, rather than based on whatever he thought he knew from playing dating sims or whatever rules he's picked up that there are in this society that he's now found himself in. Eris is already fond of Rudy. He's one of only a few people she likes at all. But her cold feet are a reminder, even to her, that however tough she is and whatever her family want, She's still young and she's not ready yet. That's why they promise not to do anything until they're of age. Not because she's a lazily written character who just reverts to potential love interest after each of these incidents, but because she, Rudy, and the relationship itself are developing, and she's written to have thoughts and feelings about this. Her thoughts and feelings, to me, are complicated and believable for someone in her situation. So I just have to ask, what consequences would have made it better written? As with Sylphy, should Eris be traumatized forever, even though nothing really happened because it was all stopped by her saying no very quickly, and even though being traumatized doesn't fit her character? Should she hate and mistrust Rudy forever afterwards, even though he shows her much better behaviour and has learned his lesson from these experiences and the way they made them both feel? So actually, nothing else happens until Eris decides it will. Consequences can just be someone learning that that action did in fact hurt someone or make them angry, and learning from that. In these cases with Sylphy or Eris, this doesn't require them to be hurt or angry to an overblown level for the circumstances or their characters, or for them not to forgive and forget. A temporary rift in a growing relationship can be enough of a consequence if understanding it and resolving it helps the character develop, and that's what's done with these early Rudeus bad behaviours. I guess the message intended is, if you have bad social skills, treat women like video game characters, and don't try to understand how they feel, they're going to be angry or hurt, and it will harm your relationships. But a lot of things can be repaired and grow even stronger if you reflect on why this happened and try to make it right. That's how I'd take it. But the writer of this article seems to take it as, if you assault women, it's fine, they will still be into you anyway. But seriously, this is a complicated 26-volume fantasy series, not that very special episode of Different Strokes where the guy from the bike shop tried to nonce up the Drummond kids. But now, the absolute outrage gets even stronger as he gets on to Lilia and Paul. It's a pattern the writing falls into over and over again. Rudeus essays or degrades a woman or girl he's close to. Occasionally, it seems like the show might be building up to challenging him for his actions and forcing him to confront the way he hurts people. But ultimately, it has the offended party forgive him with little to no criticism of his behaviour, putting the onus on the girls he takes advantage of to absolve him of his crimes and save him the emotional weight of truly reckoning with the harm he causes. Yet even that, somehow, is topped in awfulness by a moment in season 2, where he kidnaps, molests and tortures a pair of female bullies after they smash his anime figurine. Surely something this extreme would cause some narrative fallout, right? But no, once again, nothing. Sylphy is nothing but supportive of Rudeus after she finds out what's going on. And not only do the girls not tell the school about being assaulted and tied up for days on end, they also become part of Rudeus's friend group. Literally, the very next episode, they're just hanging around him like everything's normal, and he gets to keep groping them with no repercussions beyond, once again, slapstick anime violence. This is supposedly a serious fantasy story that's not afraid of heavy ideas. But violence against women is always lightweight enough to be dismissed as comedy. Retribution towards male characters is also nowhere near as detailed or focused on humiliation. Rudy's comeuppance against a prince who falsely imprisons him, for example, is for the prince to be beaten and arrested pretty unceremoniously. Only the girls need to not just be punished, but brought down a peg. This doesn't even get into Rudeus buying a girl as a slave to make those anime figurines, which would be part of a whole nother article. I already went over what I think about this part and also the Julie thing in my full review of Season 2 Part 1, so I'll keep this brief. But just how much of a menace the girls were at the university was underplayed in the anime, just to save time, and we didn't see the pre-existing beef between them and Fitz, which goes back to before Rudy came to the university. But basically, these were characters that needed to be taken down a peg, and not because they were women, but because they're princesses of the Beast tribe, physically very, very strong, and had been basically running a delinquent beast gang, bullying the whole school. Rudy's figurine being smashed upsets him on principle. It's another reference to his reverence of Roxy. He even stated himself that he could have just easily repaired it. But it sets up a funny reason why these girls have now messed with the wrong person. It's well established in season 1 that Rudy knows a lot about how beast people think and how their society works. He speaks their language, and he's lived among these girls' own families. As with the other fantasy races in this fantasy setting, beast people are just not the same as humans culturally, and he knows that he has to show dominance in order to get them to respect him. And yes, a lot of it is done for comedy, and I'm sure people who don't like these sorts of jokes in anime in general still see that as problematic, but it's a stretch to say it means anything about how the series regards women. If, say, Ariel, who's also a princess but is human, had offended Rudeus, he would probably have handled it very differently. It's about what these specific characters are like, how their culture is in the world building, and the fact they're the comic relief characters of that particular friend group, and not, this is how Rudy interacts with women. This is a series with many different races, with magic, with political machinations going on everywhere. You just can't expect that women in it will be written in a way that's always sympathetic to what might be issues for women in the real world. Would men view women as weak and vulnerable by default, when physical strength isn't all that relevant in a world where magic and magic-assisted sword styles are a thing? We see Eris, who's about 14 at the time, take out several trained male assassins to protect a female knight and a child, and before she's even properly started her training. Incidentally, when she does train and the story goes more into the 3 main sword styles, a lot of the strongest characters are women, and no distinction in potential is ever made, because having mana involved in attacks, defense, and even stamina is a very big equalizer, and that's just how it is in the setting. Talent and training can make someone the strongest of all, whereas in real life, it could, in most cases, only make a woman the strongest woman. Every adventuring party, every faction, every style of magic or swordplay or any other grouping of people in this setting has powerful women in it who men treat as just as threatening or worthy of respect as they do the men, because due to how the setting works, it would be a very big mistake for them not to. The only times we do see women treated in a different way to men is in terms of things like marriage among human nobles, where these kinds of societies within the setting are more inspired by medieval Europe, and so with bloodlines being important, politically, the fact that they still have the normal human way of reproducing is still going to be a factor. But that's hardly some weird new concept that the author of Mushoku Tensei invented in order to be problematic. This is how allergic Mushoku Tensei is to letting Rudeus suffer for his actions. It asks you to believe that all these girls and women, across all these instances of violation and abuse, decide it's no big deal when Rudeus hurts them in countless different ways. It puts the onus on its female characters to accept and love him, or at least tolerate him, to absolve him of all of his crimes without ever letting him face the fallout that such monstrous acts would naturally result in. It reduces them to props in his story, objects for his fulfillment and personal satisfaction. He is not challenged for his actions, he's rewarded for them time and again. The only characters allowed to call Rudy out on his actions in a way that causes him to reflect and change are older male authority figures like Regerd or Soldat. While Roxy might tutor him in magic and emotionally nurture him through his early years, the story never allows women the space to criticize him. As for Rudeus only listening when men call him out, you've basically only seen the part of the story where he's essentially growing up from his very stunted past life state and trying to learn how to be a man. It's normal then that the people he'd look to for guidance would be more experienced men, like Regerd, Soldat and Paul. Though with all three, he also calls them out himself on some things. At this stage of his life, women he looks up to more serve as people he can learn about the world or learn skills from. This doesn't mean there are no women he'd listen to if they called him out. It's just not what was done to affect his growth as much in the childhood and adolescence part of the story. And anyway, we're already past that phase. He certainly was affected by Norn calling him out. Yes, the article was written before that episode, but you can see that as he moves more from a child to someone who can be a father himself, the father figure type roles aren't such a feature, and he takes a dressing down from anyone he respects, regardless of whether they're a man or a woman. This is a fairly normal progression in any story that includes a male protagonist growing up, because I guess it probably reflects what young men do actually look for while they're finding themselves. So I've no idea why it's so abhorrent to Garrick in this particular series. But next he says, at this point you might be thinking, well, are there any times Rudeus faces consequences for his actions? And yes, kind of. Eris leaves him at the end of the first season, and he tries to rebound with another girl named Sara, thinking that rushing into things with her will help salve the pain of losing his first relationship. But his abandonment issues leave him with erectile dysfunction, and the shame of being so emasculated causes him to get drunk and lash out with sexist mockery to avoid confronting the root cause. He's scared to form meaningful relationships because he doesn't want to risk the pain of them falling apart like they did with Eris. She kicks him to the curb and we never see her again. She's out of his life for good. Followed by a screenshot of Sara saying, "You're the worst, never let me see you again," with the caption, "The most satisfying moment in the entire show." Now, it's kind of bold of you to say we never see Sara again. I mean, I'm not spoiling in this video, but just because not every character is in every arc, that doesn't mean they've been written out, unless they're dead. Still, he continues, "Here, at last, Mushoku Tensei provides a storyline in which Rudeus has to face the music. He's presented as unambiguously in the wrong. His mistakes have believable repercussions, and he's forced to live with those consequences with no takebacks or do-overs. It only took 30 episodes, but for the first time, the show addresses Rudeus's flaws with the weight and thoughtfulness they deserve. Except, this arc ends up exposing yet another problem. See, Sara is initially cold and hostile towards Rudeus before warming up to him. But we never actually find out why she hates his guts at first. She's just standoffish and rude for no reason until he saves her life and she falls in love with him. Think how easy it would be to frame her dislike of him around his misogyny, or his habit of violating consent, or any number of his actual character flaws. Instead, the writing frames her as an ice queen in need of a man to thaw her out, rather than interrogate why someone might be put off a person like Rudeus. Okay, the show didn't explain why she's cold to Rudeus. I do explain it in my video about Sara if you want to watch that, but I will grant that for anime onlys, it does seem like she's just being tsundere. But this bit? where he says, "Think how easy it would be to frame her dislike of him around his misogyny or his habit of violating consent or any number of his actual character flaws." Well, sorry, but when during his encounters with Sara does he display any misogyny? He's depressed, he's heartbroken, and the only things keeping him going are looking for his mother and knowing that the teacher that he reveres, who is also a woman, is still out there. He admires and respects Sara's fighting talents and Suzanne, the other female member of the party. Why would Sara think he was misogynistic and dislike him for it? As for violating consent, he hasn't done anything like that for about 5 years at this point, so I'm not sure why it would make sense for her to have that as her beef with him either. Without going into it all, she dislikes people like him. That is, nobles who try to be adventurers. She also has a particular reason to dislike the Greyrat noble line. She has trouble trusting anyone outside of her party anyway, and Rudeus's depressed demeanour just annoys her. As she gets to know him, she rethinks her assumptions about him, and when he saves her to help both her and her party out, she finally fully accepts him. But no, it'd be much better if she disliked him for flaws he had much earlier on in the story that he no longer displays, because the reasons in the actual story weren't gender related enough for the anime feminist, I guess. Still, he keeps banging on. This reveals a bizarre corollary to the Rudeus's lack of consequences. The show pretty much only lets characters be antagonistic towards him when it's explicitly unjustified. For all the times he steals girls' underwear and taunts them with it, the only time he almost pays for it is when a pair falls on his face by accident and the onlookers mistakenly think he stole it. For all the times he violates consent and molests the girls and women around him, the only time it has a meaningful impact is when a group of beast people mistakenly think he's molesting their sacred wolf, when he was really just petting it, and imprison him for a small side arc. All the things he actually does wrong, Mushoku Tensei bends over backwards to treat it as no big deal. But when the world does push against Rudeus's actions, it's nearly always in situations where he's not actually at fault, and the people criticising him are framed as in the wrong. I don't have much to add to that bit that I haven't already said, and I do really want to get to the next and final part because I think it's the most misguided take of them all. But that bit about how he taunts girls with stolen underwear, are you sure you weren't just watching Konosuba? But finally, here we are, at the conclusion of all of this writer's grievances. All this leads to a truly vile sentiment underpinning the portrayal of Rudeus's actions. By easily forgiving him for his mistakes and casting all of his harshest critics as misguided, Mushoku Tensei asks its audience to view its loathsome protagonist as someone who can do no wrong. It leads you to associate Rudeus being challenged for his actions with false accusations not worth being taken seriously. It creates a narrative framing where Rudeus molesting, grooming and assaulting children is, at worst, a harmless and forgivable annoyance, and anyone who tries to make him face consequences for it has no idea what they're talking about. And there's no situation it won't twist unnaturally to preserve that framing. Mushoku Tensei wants you to believe it's a story about redemption. It wants you to believe it's about how even the worst person can change for the better. Perhaps in another world where it handled these topics well, it could have been just as powerful as Thomas Covenant in its portrayal of a reprehensible protagonist struggling to become a good person. But by denying Rudeus the consequences of his actions and refusing to frame him as in the wrong, it instead becomes a story about how the worst people aren't so bad after all. It's a perfectly constructed fantasy where a PDF R-wordist gets to be in the right, no matter how loathsome his actions, where his critics are never justified, where he never has to deal with the after effects, where his victims are perfectly compliant accessories who absolve him of every indiscretion. It suggests there's no need for a person like Rudeus to change the worst aspects of himself, and that anyone who says otherwise isn't worth listening to. It's impossible not to see shades of real life in this apologism. How we give second chances to famous men exposed for being PDF files, like Roman Polanski, Shimabukuro Mitsutoshi, and Watsuki Nobuhiro, because of how much we love the art they produce. Their contributions to society are given precedence over the children they've preyed upon, their crimes excused with the same underlying logic the writing applies to Rudeus. In fiction and reality, being a PDF file becomes an acceptable character flaw, one you never have to reckon with, repair, or make amends for. If nothing else, that's the one way Mushoku Tensei does capture something real, albeit unintentionally. Except, in real life, it's not the hand of the author protecting predators from the consequences of their actions. It's the hand of a society that forgives the unforgivable, because it's more convenient than acknowledging just how many sacrifices are required to keep the illusion of justice alive. And as long as we continue to frame a man's personal accomplishments and emotional journey as more important than the women and girls he harms along the way, then the so-called redemption of our own world's Rudeuses will be the consequences that the rest of us will continue to face for a long, long time to come. This is the stupidest conclusion anybody could possibly force out of Mushoku Tensei. I'm sorry, is this story about a powerful or famous man who abuses children and it's treated like no big deal? Because I could have sworn it was about a guy who spiraled into being a shut-in, forgotten by society, who gets a second chance and learns to get over his trauma and degeneracy through both his own efforts and the help of people he learns to have healthy relationships with. It's a story about someone who had absolutely no power in society and no contact with anybody, let alone protection from people or influence over others. Rudeus' story is about the recovery of someone with a damaged psyche, not the redemption of one of the worst people in the world anyway. Likening Rudeus to the likes of Roman Polanski is like likening a recovering drug addict in a story to a real-life cartel boss. What are you even thinking when you're watching or reading this story that could possibly lead to this being the big flagship point of your analysis of it? I genuinely want to know. But what do you guys think if you've made it this far? Let me know in the comments. Thank you as always to everyone who helps support this very poor little cat girl, and thank you also to everyone who subscribes and likes my videos. Thank you for watching this one, and I hope to see you again very soon.